Lieutenant Adrian Roberts was working frantically. He and his men hustled to load the last crates of ammunition and medical supplies onto armored personnel carriers. Roberts knew D Company was out there in the rain-soaked jungle near Long Tan, surrounded, low on supplies, and clinging to survival. The trek to reach them meant wrestling against a relentless monsoon that had transformed the ground into mud. But time was critical. D Company desperately needed backup. As Roberts prepared to move out, the radio crackled to life with a cold command, quote, "Hold off." He froze, processing the weight of that order. The isolated men of D Company, just over 100 soldiers, were facing a crushing force of over 2,000 Viet Cong troops. Torn between his orders and the lives of his comrades, Roberts weighed the choice that could decide not only their fate, but the outcome of the battle: obey or defy. The Patrol. Australian forces first set foot in Vietnam in 1965, initially as part of the broader American-led coalition. However, tensions soon began to simmer between the two allies. The Australians, seasoned veterans of guerrilla warfare from their experiences in the Malayan Emergency, were uncomfortable with the U.S. approach to the war, which emphasized heavy bombardment and attrition. The Australians instead preferred their own swift, surgical tactics aimed at winning hearts and minds while avoiding large-scale conventional battles. Determined to prove their approach was more effective, the Australians established an independent base in Long Phuoc, deep within Viet Cong-held territory. This base, Noi Dat, offered the strategic terrain they needed: dense jungle, a nearby port, and familiar landscapes suited to jungle warfare. Brigadier Oliver David Jackson, commanding officer of the 1st Australian Task Force, quickly set up a fortified position with a 4,000-meter exclusion zone, expelling all civilians to prevent Viet Cong infiltration. On the early morning of August 16, 1966, at exactly 2:43 a.m., carnage descended upon the Australians without warning. The stillness of the night was shattered as a massive barrage of mortar shells slammed into Noi Dat. Over 100 rounds, including 75mm recoilless rifles and a Japanese 70mm howitzer, screamed through the air, bursting on impact. The explosions rocked the camp, sending plumes of smoke into the air. Tents were shredded, equipment blasted apart, and the ground trembled as shrapnel cut through the ranks. The air was thick with dust and smoke, the acrid scent of burning debris mixing with the fresh, wet smell of the earth. The south and southeast sectors bore the brunt of the attack. 24 men were wounded, one fatally. As the initial barrage subsided, the Australian artillerymen immediately took action. But there was a problem. Their radar systems were malfunctioning. The men adapted quickly, cross-referencing the sound of enemy gunfire and adjusting their own fire based on compass bearings. With precision, they launched 240 shells at the Viet Cong positions, successfully neutralizing the threat. Finally, by around 4 a.m., the incoming barrage had slowed to a trickle. Regardless, Noi Dat's artillery crews continued to fire, hammering enemy retreat routes. Soon after, the Australians ventured into the field, seeking any signs of the retreating Viet Cong. They found only the blood-soaked soil and abandoned uniforms, evidence of the enemy's hasty withdrawal after the failed attack. The Australians were still licking their wounds when D Company of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, along with the New Zealand Artillery Observer Team, departed Noi Dat at around 11 a.m. Their mission, led by Sergeant Bob Buick, was to relieve B Company, which was stationed near a rubber plantation. While the men of D Company had every reason to believe the worst was behind them, they were unaware that they were walking straight into a hornet's nest. Back at camp, musical entertainers Little Patty and Cole Joy were preparing for a concert to lift the spirits of the troops. The men of D Company, however, would miss it as they marched eastward through the sweltering jungle. The rain was starting to fall, soaking their uniforms and turning the already treacherous terrain into a nightmare of thick mud. But as they patrolled east, faint music filtered through the trees. At 3:40 p.m., as the forward sections moved into the trees, Sergeant Bob Buick spotted 6 to 8 Viet Cong approaching from the south, unaware they were walking into the platoon's midst. Heart pounding, Buick took aim and fired, instantly hitting one of the enemy. The remaining Viet Cong scattered, vanishing into the dense jungle. In a heartbeat, Buick had turned the tables. But Buick knew that this skirmish was a mere prelude. These soldiers were part of the elite 275th Regiment and D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion, notorious for their lethal tactics. And there were definitely more of them, close by, laying in wait, ready to pounce. The trap. The Australians pressed forward, their senses sharp, bracing for the next wave. The air filled with tension as every step could trigger another clash in the hostile jungle. By 4 p.m., the soldiers of D Company were fully entrenched in the jungle, unaware that they were walking into a carefully laid trap. The dense underbrush had concealed the enemy's movements, and suddenly the air erupted with the deafening sound of small arms fire, rocket-propelled grenades, and explosions. The 275th Regiment and D445 Battalion had surrounded them from all sides. The Australians were trapped. To make matters worse, the monsoon brought a battering rain that reduced visibility to mere meters. The torrential downpour made it nearly impossible to see the enemy or react quickly to their positions. The ground was now a quagmire, slowing movement and adding to the sense of hopelessness. This didn't deter Lieutenant Gordon Sharp. With his heart pounding, he peered over the low ridge, eyes scanning the jungle for any sign of movement. With the enemy closing in, he knew the artillery could be their only hope. Rising from cover, he waved the fire coordinates to the gunners, shouting instructions to adjust the range. His hands shook as he watched the rounds fall, praying they would hit their mark. Just as the first shell exploded in the distance, a sharp crack split the air. His body jerked violently as a sniper's bullet pierced his chest. He collapsed, eyes still on the battlefield, his final act ensuring the artillery had a fighting chance. With Sharp KIA, the leadership of 11th Platoon fell to Sergeant Bob Buick, who immediately took control of the shattered unit. In a desperate move, he grabbed the radio and called for more ammunition. Just as he finished, a single shot rang out, and the radio antenna snapped clean off, cutting off any hope of further contact. The crisis. At Company HQ, just behind the forward platoons, Major Harry Smith, commanding officer of D Company, maintained steady control amid the chaos and torrential rain. With over 2,000 Viet Cong forces closing in on their position, Smith stayed in relentless contact with Sergeant Buick and the others, coordinating the defense with precise artillery fire and timely air support. Each artillery strike was calculated to delay the advancing enemy, allowing D Company to regroup and reinforce their thinning perimeter. Smith's orders were sharp and direct, his calm voice steadying his troops as mortar shells roared overhead. Against overwhelming odds, Smith's resolve held D Company together, each strike buying them precious seconds to endure. Sergeant Buick remarked on the importance of Major Smith's steadied leadership, saying, quote, "I must admit, looking back now, if Harry Smith hadn't been the commander he was, and if myself and other sergeants and corporals we had in D Company had not been of the caliber they were, I don't think we would have survived a long time." But Smith's leadership still wasn't enough to bring the 108 men out of harm's way. By 5:15 p.m., D Company was fully surrounded. Every movement was met with incoming fire, and their options for escape had dwindled. The pressure was mounting. The 10th Platoon attempted to flank left, but was immediately met with a barrage of small arms fire, forcing them to retreat. The 12th Platoon, advancing through the thick jungle, was ambushed. Explosions and gunfire rained down, casualties piling up rapidly. Worst of all, the 10th Platoon's radio was still damaged, leaving them cut off from the rest of the company. With the situation growing dire, Private William Yank Akel, a signaller, knew that restoring communication was their only hope. Without hesitation, he sprinted into the firestorm. Bullets whizzed past him, striking the ground and trees around him, but Akel didn't falter. He kept his head low, his heart pounding in his chest. As he ran, he fired back, taking out 2 Viet Cong soldiers in his path, forcing them to scatter. His legs burned, and his breath came in ragged gasps as he covered the almost 300 meters. Every step felt like an eternity, but he pushed through, knowing that the fate of D Company rested on his shoulders. Finally, reaching the isolated 10th Platoon, Akel handed over the new radio, restoring communication just as the enemy closed in. The relief. As the battle raged and D Company fought for survival, Lieutenant Adrian Roberts, back at Noi Dat, knew that reinforcements were desperately needed. The Armored Personnel Carriers, or APCs, under his command were loaded with supplies and ready, their engines rumbling with power. But every moment that passed seemed to stretch the tension to its breaking point. Roberts could feel the pressure mounting, his men itching to strike out into the hostile jungle and help their comrades. At 5 p.m., as Roberts was waiting for orders to go, he instead received orders to wait. The delay grated against his instincts. He knew the situation was dire for D Company. The enemy was closing in on them, and every second counted. Though he was told to hold off, Roberts' resolve only strengthened. With a quick glance at his APCs and seeing the eager courage in the eyes of his men, he made his decision. Ignoring the orders, he commanded his vehicles to move. By 4:45 p.m., the APCs were tearing through the dense jungle from Noi Dat. Slowed by the rain, their engines roared, and the muddy ground trembled beneath the weight of the heavy vehicles. The tracks ripped through the underbrush, the sound of metal crunching against the thick, wet foliage, signaling their approach. With the enemy coming into sight, machine guns mounted on the APCs opened fire, unleashing a devastating hail of bullets. The men inside were well drilled, laying down a storm of suppressive fire, clearing the path. Ahead, D-445 Battalion was positioning for a strike on D Company's vulnerable rear. But the APCs, moving at full speed, smashed into the enemy's flank, breaking their formation with a brutal onslaught. The machine guns raked through the jungle, cutting down Viet Cong soldiers in their path. The enemy panicked, scattering in disarray as the APCs pushed deeper into their lines, smashing through their defensive positions and breaking the siege. Finally, at around 6 p.m., the hope for more relief came from above. 2 RAAF Bell UH-1B Iroquois helicopters roared overhead, battling monsoon winds as they hovered dangerously close to the treetops. Skimming just above the jungle canopy, the pilots skillfully dropped crates of ammunition and blankets, their skids nearly scraping the mud below. The soldiers scrambled to grab the vital gear, as gunfire from the encroaching Viet Cong echoed in the distance. As dusk fell at 6:35 p.m., bugles pierced the humid jungle, marking the Viet Cong's launch of a relentless human wave assault on D Company. Emerging from the dense undergrowth, their troops were well spaced, advancing at a fast walk with precision. 90 meters behind, a reserve company marched in formation, intending to reinforce the assault. Yet just as they advanced, the Australian artillery roared to life, pounding the reserve company, shattering their formation and leaving the front echelon alone to face D Company's fierce small arms fire. But the VC pushed on, crawling through mud and debris, determined to break through the Australian lines. Another wave soon surged over the fallen, merging with survivors from the initial assault to mount a combined attack. A VC heavy machine gun was set up just 50 meters from D Company's perimeter, but it was swiftly taken down by defensive fire. Despite mounting casualties, the VC attacks came in relentless waves, with concentrated fire directed at 10th and 12th platoons from the east, southeast, and south. The uneven slope screened both sides at long range, forcing close-quarters combat as the VC closed within 50 meters, though few survived the devastating artillery to reach that distance. Under relentless pressure of the seemingly endless human wave attacks, the Australians held fast against the relentless Viet Cong. Then, through the din of gunfire and rain, came an unexpected roar. B Company had arrived. Charging into the fray, they hit the Viet Cong from the flank, breaking the siege with a fierce counterattack. The sudden arrival turned the tide, scattering the enemy forces and giving D Company the support they desperately needed. A disputed victory. As dawn broke on August 19, 1966, the brutal Battle of Long Tan finally came to a close. The wounded were evacuated by helicopter, and the bodies of fallen soldiers were carefully retrieved, marking a somber aftermath. 13 Australians had lost their lives, and over 200 Viet Cong lay fallen on the battlefield. Each side claimed victory for different reasons. The Australians emphasized their tactical achievement, highlighting how their defense thwarted a major Viet Cong assault. In contrast, the Viet Cong claimed a political victory, celebrating the strategic pressure they had exerted on the Australians. Against crushing odds, the Australians had fought with extraordinary resilience. Long Tan became a symbol of courage, a testament to those who stood firm, despite the rain, the jungle, and nearly certain defeat.